What happens when the man holding the ultimate weapon of destruction is forced to confront the legendary general who believes he is above the laws of a sovereign nation? It is April 1951, and the world stands on the precipice of a Third World War, caught in a titanic struggle between a president who rose from a haberdashery in Missouri and a military icon who viewed himself as a modern-day Caesar. This is the story of a constitutional crisis that shook the foundations of American democracy and defined the limits of military power in the nuclear age. Before we dive deeper into this clash of giants, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this incredible piece of history, and leave a comment below about a detail you didn't know or what you find most fascinating so far. The humid air of Washington, D.C. felt heavy with the weight of global consequences as Harry S. Truman paced the Oval Office, his mind focused on the frozen mountains of the Korean Peninsula. For months, the conflict had been escalating, not just on the battlefield, but within the very chain of command that governed the United States military. General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific and the architect of the Incheon landing, had begun to publicly challenge the administration's policy of limited war. Truman, a man who deeply respected the office of the presidency, found himself in an impossible position where his own commander in the field was openly advocating for an expansion of the war into mainland China. The tension was palpable in every cable sent across the Pacific, as the civilian leadership and the military elite drifted toward a collision that would change history forever. The roots of this conflict stretch back to the sudden North Korean invasion of the South in June 1950, an event that caught the Truman administration by surprise and forced a rapid mobilization of UN forces. MacArthur, operating from his headquarters in Tokyo, was granted sweeping powers to repel the invasion, which he did with tactical brilliance during the daring amphibious assault at Incheon. However, as the UN forces pushed toward the Yalu River, the border with China, the geopolitical stakes rose to a fever pitch. Truman feared that a direct confrontation with the Chinese would draw the Soviet Union into the fray, potentially triggering a nuclear exchange that would devastate the planet. MacArthur, conversely, believed that there was no substitute for victory and viewed the containment policy of the Truman administration as a form of cowardice that betrayed the men fighting in the foxholes. By late 1950, thousands of Chinese volunteers had poured across the border, catching the overextended UN forces off guard and forcing one of the longest retreats in American military history. In the wake of this setback, MacArthur's rhetoric became increasingly inflammatory as he bypassed the Joint Chiefs of Staff to communicate directly with the press and political allies in the Republican Party. He demanded the blockade of the Chinese coast, the bombing of industrial centers in Manchuria, and the use of nationalist Chinese troops from Taiwan. Truman, working alongside Secretary of State Dean Acheson and Secretary of Defense George Marshall, tried to rein in the general through private channels. But MacArthur viewed these instructions as mere suggestions from a man he considered as intellectual and social inferior. The insubordination reached a breaking point in March 1951, when MacArthur issued a public statement that effectively sabotaged a planned ceasefire initiative by the Truman administration. The general issued his own ultimatum to the Chinese commanders, threatening to expand the war and devastate their homeland if they did not surrender. This was a direct violation of a presidential directive from December 1950, which required all military officials to clear public statements with the State Department. For Truman, this was the final straw. It was no longer just a disagreement over strategy, but a direct challenge to the constitutional principle of civilian control over the military. The president knew that if he allowed MacArthur to dictate foreign policy, the office of the presidency would be permanently weakened and the risk of global catastrophe would skyrocket. In the quiet hours of the night, Truman consulted with his closest advisors, including General Omar Bradley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had grown weary of MacArthur's ego and disregard for the global strategy of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The Joint Chiefs ultimately concluded that if MacArthur were not removed, the military's discipline hierarchy would collapse. The decision was made in total secrecy to avoid a political firestorm before the orders could be delivered, but a leak was feared. Truman prepared the dismissal papers with a heavy heart, knowing that he was about to fire the most popular man in America. He understood that the public, still enamored with the hero of the Pacific, would likely turn against him, but his oath of office demanded that he protect the Constitution above his own popularity. The announcement was scheduled for early morning on April 11, 1951, but due to a communication breakdown, the news reached the press before the official notification reached MacArthur in Tokyo. When the word finally broke, it hit the American public like a thunderclap. MacArthur was relieved of his commands in the Far East, replaced by General Matthew Ridgway. The backlash was immediate and visceral. Truman was burned in effigy in cities across the country, and talk of impeachment filled the halls of Congress. Yet, in the midst of this storm, Truman remained resolute, famously stating that he fired MacArthur not because he was a dumb son of a pitch, though he felt he was, but because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. As the world watched the fallout of this monumental decision, the very fabric of American leadership was being tested in the crucible of public opinion and Cold War anxiety. MacArthur returned to the United States to a hero's welcome, receiving a ticker-tape parade in New York City that dwarfed any celebration scene since the end of World War II. He was invited to address a joint session of Congress, where he delivered his famous Old Soldiers Never Die speech, a massive display of oratory that brought tears to the eyes of his supporters and further inflamed the anger directed at the White House. This moment represents a peak of the tension, where the voice of a single general seemed to drown out the authority of the democratically elected government. If you find this exploration of historical power struggles compelling, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about what you find most interesting or something you didn't know before about this clash. While the public cheered for MacArthur, the Senate began a series of closed-door hearings to investigate the circumstances of his dismissal and the conduct of the war. These hearings, led by the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees, became a turning point in the narrative. Under the careful questioning of senators, the military's top brass, including George Marshall and Omar Bradley, testified that MacArthur's proposed strategies would have left the United States vulnerable in Europe and could have led to a disastrous war with the Soviet Union. Bradley's testimony was particularly devastating, as he remarked that MacArthur's plan would involve the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Slowly, the tide of public opinion began to shift as the complexities of the Cold War and the dangers of MacArthur's provocations became clearer to the average citizen. People started to realize that the general's dismissal was not a personal vendetta by Truman, but a necessary act to preserve the global alliance and prevent a nuclear holocaust. The hearing stripped away the legend of the infallible general and revealed a man whose ambition had blinded him to the broader realities of a world transformed by atomic weapons. Truman's popularity remained low, but he had successfully navigated the greatest threat to civilian control of the military in American history, ensuring that the president, not a general, would always have the final word on matters of war and peace. The remainder of the Korean War was fought under the disciplined leadership of Ridgway, who stabilized the lines and eventually brought the conflict to a stalemate and armistice in 1953. MacArthur's political ambitions, which many suspected were the true motive behind his public defiance, faded as he failed to secure the Republican nomination for the presidency in 1952. The MacArthur crisis became a case study for future leaders on the importance of clear communication and the absolute necessity of maintaining the chain of command. Truman's courage in making an unpopular but legally sound decision eventually earned him the respect of historians, who now view his stand against MacArthur as one of the most significant moments in the history of the American presidency. In the final assessment of history, the clash between Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur serves as a reminder that the strength of a republic lies not in the charisma of its generals, but in the integrity of its laws and the courage of its leaders to uphold them. Truman's legacy is defined by his willingness to be the most hated man in the country for a season in order to protect the democratic principles that had sustained the nation for nearly 2 centuries. As we reflect on this era of high-stakes diplomacy and military defiance, we must ask ourselves how we value the balance of power today. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal moments in history. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about which part of this narrative surprised you the most as the spring of 1951 bloomed in Washington. The political atmosphere remained frigid, a stark contrast to the burgeoning heat of the Cold War. Harry Truman, often underestimated as a simple man from Missouri, was proving to be a titan of constitutional integrity. He spent his evenings reading the reports from the front lines, where the carnage of the Korean War was being measured in the thousands of lives lost. Truman understood that the shadow of the atomic bomb changed every rule of engagement that had existed during MacArthur's formative years in the First World War. To Truman, the preservation of the United Nations coalition was the only barrier preventing a total collapse of Western civilization. He viewed MacArthur's letters to congressmen as a betrayal not just of the president, but of the very soldiers who relied on a unified command structure to ensure their sacrifices were not in vain. The geopolitical chessboard was far more complex than a simple battlefield map involving secret treaties, the burgeoning power of the Soviet Union, and the fragile recovery of post-war Europe. Truman's advisors, particularly Dean Acheson, pointed out that if the United States moved to bomb Chinese bases, the Soviet-Chinese Mutual Defense Treaty would likely be triggered, bringing Russian bombers over the skies of Tokyo and potentially Paris. MacArthur, insulated by his own legend in Tokyo, dismissed these fears as defeatist. This fundamental disagreement on the reality of global risk was a catalyst for the final rupture. The general was operating in a vacuum of his own making, convinced that his personal destiny was intertwined with the liberation of Asia, regardless of the cost to the rest of the world. Truman, conversely, was thinking in terms of decades, seeking to establish a precedent where nuclear weapons would remain a tool of last resort, controlled strictly by civilian hands. As the dismissal orders were finalized, the White House staff worked in a state of high anxiety, knowing that the fallout would be historic. Truman remained the calmest man in the building, his resolve hardened by his belief that he was doing exactly what the founders of the Republic intended. He wrote in his private diary that the general had left him no choice, for if commander could publicly dispute the policy of his government without consequence, the government itself would cease to be a democracy and become a military junta. This was the core of the drama, not a clash of personalities, but a clash of philosophies regarding the nature of power. The president was prepared to face the vitriol of the press and the potential end of his political career to ensure that the precedent of civilian supremacy remained untarnished for his successors. When the news finally reached the public, the reaction was a mixture of shock and fury that is difficult to comprehend in the modern era. MacArthur was a living god to many, the man who had promised, "I shall return to the Philippines," and delivered. To see him dismissed by a man who had been a failed haberdasher was an insult many Americans could not stomach. Protests erupted from Los Angeles to New York, and the switchboards at the White House were overwhelmed with angry calls. Yet behind the scenes, the military establishment was beginning to breathe a sigh of relief. Many high-ranking officers had feared MacArthur's unpredictability, and the transition to General Ridgway's command brought a much-needed sense of professional stability to the Korean theater. Truman watched the chaos in the Oval Office, knowing that the truth would eventually emerge from the shadows of populist emotion. The Senate hearings that followed provided a sober, detailed look at the strategic disagreements that led to the firing. Day after day, the great debate unfolded, revealing that MacArthur had indeed ignored direct orders to clear his public statements. The testimony of General Omar Bradley served as a masterclass in global strategy, explaining that the military's primary responsibility was to the defense of the United States as a whole, not just one specific theater of operations. As the transcript of the hearings were published, the American public began to see the logic behind Truman's decision. The mystery of the fired general transformed into a lesson on the dangers of unchecked ego in a nuclear-armed world. Truman's popularity stayed in the basement, but he had successfully defended the office of the presidency from an unprecedented challenge, ensuring the stability of the American system for generations to come. Through the long lens of history, the 75-minute struggle between these two men reveals the delicate balance required to lead a superpower. It shows that leadership is often about making the most difficult, least popular choice when the future of the world is on the line. Truman's give him hell attitude was never more evident than when he stood his ground against a military legend. As we conclude this deep dive into one of the most significant power struggles in human history, remember that the lessons of the past are the blueprints for our future. To continue exploring these epic narratives of courage and conflict, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about which leader's perspective you found more compelling or something new you learned today.